In this episode of my podcast, I build on the gambler's fallacy. The examples that I use to explain this fallacy are almost hilarious at times, but I think that the impact it has on our lives and the way we think is quite significant. I think it's going to be a short and sweet episode, like so many others in this podcast already. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Hello, good people of the internet. Welcome to the Unlearning Playground, an everyday life podcast by Chetan Narang. The gambler's fallacy. There is a very easy way to actually understand this fallacy. I'll just give a very simple example. Let's say you toss a coin 10 times, and every single time it lands on heads. Now, if I'm going to toss it one more time, the 11th time, what do you think is the impact the previous 10 runs have on the 11th coin toss? If your answer is that it's somehow more likely that the next coin toss would result in a tail instead of a head, you just fell prey to the gambler's fallacy. So, in short, in purely layman terms, what the gambler's fallacy is this belief, this bias that we have in our heads that absolutely random events are somehow impacted by previous occurrences of the same or similar random events, right? So, the example that I just explained above, a coin toss is an absolutely random event. Every time you toss a coin, there's an equal chance that it's going to land on either a head or a tail. But if you start to see a pattern in it, if you start to see that, oh yes, the previous 10 coin tosses have landed on heads, so the next one is more likely to be a tail. That is the gambler's fallacy. That is a logical fallacy because the 11th coin toss is an independent event. It does not matter whether all of the previous 10 or 100 or 1,000 runs resulted in the same outcome. The next one is again a random event. It can be either of them. The previous runs have no bearing on what the next outcome will be. But somehow we tend to believe in this pattern and therefore fall prey to what we call the gambler's fallacy. There is actually a very hilarious example that explains this fallacy very clearly. It's a popular joke in Hindi, but I'll try to translate into English today. It goes something like this. There was once a doctor who was, let's say, an expert in a particular surgery. So a patient comes over to him and he had to get that surgery done. And this patient was quite obviously very nervous. It was a major surgery. So he was expressing his concern in front of the doctor that I'm worried and I don't know what will happen and so on. And the doctor sounded pretty certain. He said, "Don't worry, I'm sure this is gonna go well. I'm sure you're gonna be fine after the surgery." Now the patient was relieved, but he asked him, "Doctor, I want to understand, how are you so certain? I mean, so sure that it's gonna be fine." The doctor said, "Well, it's pretty simple. The surgery has a success rate of 10%. So 1 out of 10 such operations are successful. Of course, 9 out of 10 patients die. But the previous 9 times I've done this surgery, all 9 patients have died. So I'm certain that you're going to be the right one. I'm certain that this next operation that I'm going to do on you is going to be fine." This is the gambler's fallacy. Again, just reiterating, all of those operations are separately independent events. So there is a 90% failure rate in each of them. It does not mean that if 90 previous operations have resulted in the death of the patient, the next 10 ones are going to be fine because the universe has to somehow maintain this pattern of 90% failure rate. It doesn't work that way. And most of this follows from this bias of our minds to actually see patterns where there are none. You know, we are kind of, in one manner of speaking, we are far too willing to reject the truth that much of what we see in life is actually random. But of course, if your job depends on it, if your ego or if your sense of self, your sense of identity depends on it, of course you would wish to draw a pattern and act on all of those patterns. But that does not mean they're true, right? Now, you see, this entire thing is not just limited to the gambler. So the gambler's fallacy is not just about a gambler who goes on and bets on a particular outcome in the casino or whatnot. This has actual real life implications too. For example, if you are someone who invests in the stock market, you are very likely to fall prey to this bias, because if you see that the market has been falling for, let's say, quite a few number of days or months or whatever is your time period that you measure it in, it might seem more likely to you that the market is going to rise now. Or very similarly, not just talking about the macro markets, you might think the same about a particular stock, because if you see it's on an upward rise, and it has been on an upward rise for quite a few number of months or days or whatever, you might start to fall prey to the bias that it's more probable that it's going to fall down, and therefore you might sell off, and in that way lose some profits that you could have made, right? And very similarly, this was a very specific one. I remember reading about this in some book or some podcast. Maybe I consumed this. There was some research done which showed that loan officers are more likely to deny a loan application if they just granted the previous one. And very similarly, parole officers are more likely to deny a parole application if they had just granted a previous one. Because, this is, I think it can be rooted down to the bias that since the previous file or the previous candidate was a deserving one, this one is less likely to be deserving. And again, we come back to the same explanation. All of those files, all of those candidates are actually independent events, are actually independent occurrences. So the bias of the story that carries over from the previous experience is actually just that, another bias. And in one manner of speaking, this is actually a result of our brains being suckers for causal relationships. Like I said, we try to see patterns where either one does not exist, or rather where the pattern really doesn't make any rational sense. For example, it's kind of the same fallacy that applies when, let's say, things have been going south for us, and we start to believe that, oh, God is testing our faith, and therefore we need to double down our efforts to please him, her, or that, or whatever is your pronoun for the Almighty, right? And see, of course, there are situations where past events are a good indicator for a future event too. I mean, if you've been out on a stormy day and you know that there's a storm brewing and there are dark clouds and whatnot, and you have experienced that this usually leads to a rain, it's actually healthy to realize that if it's a stormy day today, it might lead to a rain. So past occurrences in this sense can really guide you that what the future could be. But on a host of other occasions, a new event might have absolutely no relationship with the previous events, except the relationships that we are kind of brewing in our own heads. Just like that God example I just gave you. If you convince yourself that a pattern exists, you fall prey to your own bias. And more than seeing that you are wrong or right, see whether you can be better. And in this situation, you can very easily be better. So the next time you seem to be drawing a conclusion based on a pattern you most definitely see, think again, meditate on it. Maybe you see the pattern only because you wished to see a pattern, any pattern. In his very famous book, Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky actually had one of his characters spit out this really potent truth. He said, facts are not everything. At least half of the game is knowing how to handle the facts. And the more aware you are of your own biases, your own delusions, your own fallacies, the more equipped you are to handle the facts. And don't for a second let anyone deceive you by convincing you that your own thinking is not biased, is not prone to logical fallacies. All of us are prone to all of these fallacies and these cognitive biases. So, a little more self awareness hurts no one. And that is precisely one of the reasons why I run this series of cognitive biases on my podcast. So, I think this is where I'll end this episode. If you think that the content you just heard resonates with you, if you think that the message that I'm trying to give out resonates with you, and makes sense to you, please share this with your community, share this with your people, because I think messages like this need to go out to more and more people. And in the social media age that we live in, of course, a little more self-awareness is going to hurt no one. So I think I'll leave you at that. Until next time, peace out.